Washington's plans for the fort. He had two sets of plans, and they're down in the Library of Congress in the Manuscript Division, and I spent a lot of time in there with the white gloves on. He not only had a plan for the fort, but he had scale. He put a scale on each one, so there was no question about, and he had a profile of the fort, so there was no question about height or horizontal. Now he insisted his fort be built of hewn logs. These are hewn logs. They could be anywhere from 8 inches, 10 inches, 12 inches, and they were joined together, as you can see here, with ones going perpendicular to the ones on the outside. The walls were 16 feet high. That's hard to imagine until you get out here and look up to the second story of this building and you realize what the 16 feet encountered. There were 24 pieces of cannon, 6 in each bastion. These are the bastions. These are the curtains, or the walls as you call them. Now the walls themselves started at the base 18 feet and tapered up to 14 feet. You can see they leaned in at a 17-degree angle. Now the first flagstaff was not in the center as I thought it would be, as one man drew it years ago, but down here on the southwest bastion, right at the corner of the southwest bastion. Inside he had 3 barracks, 2-story. The one on the end, and we're standing in part of that one now, is the north barracks. Was 80 feet long by 18 feet wide, and as I say, 2 stories. These 2 here were for the officers of the regiment. This was George Washington's office, a story and a half. He had a little room upstairs and a room downstairs with a fireplace almost in the center. The other one was, believe it or not, a prison for the soldiers that didn't follow the rules. And these were used for various things, not only to house the men, but also as a hospital. And what he did, he had a fireplace at each end of the buildings where the men could do their cooking. George Washington didn't leave any details out when you start studying the man. And he insisted that they have their own cooking space. He allocated so many square feet for each man, because when he drew up the plans for his forts for his officers to build out on the frontier, he specified how much room was to be for X number of men. So, I mean, he was very particular on his details. Now, he tried to build a ditch using the rules of fortification. He tried to build a ditch around it, but it turned out years later the observers pointed out that he didn't get very far, because all you have to do is go down a few inches out here in this soil and you hit limestone. And it was hard enough to put the well in. I wish I had a pointer here. But the well was right at the end of the west barracks, up by this northwest bastion. We are standing right here inside of the north barracks. This next door house was a parade ground where he would bring his men up to parade. Now these are the escarpments where they build up the surrounding. This was on the hill, and it drops off sharply both on the east and on the west. So he had to bring in tons of earth to get this level so he could start laying his fort. Now this, for several years, was the most outstanding landmark of the fort, the southwest bastion. It is now the parking lot of the Fort Loudoun Apartments. And just a few years ago, they took that down to now it's just almost down to this level here, this point here. But I can point that out to you when we go on the tour. This one still, the escarpment for this one still exists right across the street from the pink brick house. This one is, a house is sitting right here on top of it, and another house here, so forth. But later on, in the early part of the 19th century, they extended North Loudoun Street right straight to the fort. Until that time, the road going to Philadelphia, or the old Indian path, was right down here, and it's now an alleyway called Kent Lane. They circled around like this, and so in later years in the 19th century, they cut straight through. He went right through here, not right in the middle. This went down and curved and went into the main street of Winchester. As they went right through the East Barracks, went through half of George Washington's headquarters, half of the North Barracks, and the first part of that bastion over there. Now with that, let's go out and let's just start our little tour of this. Can everybody see it? Here's an overlay of the fort set up on the present day. I had to scale the GIS and then I made the overlay for it. This is the outer perimeter of the fort. Now by that I mean it's outside the ditch. Here is the bastion tips. From bastion tip to bastion tip, the square fort, 204 feet. We have approximately the fort proper, just a little less, about 995 of an acre, while this is over an acre and a half for the covers. Now here's the Fort Loudoun apartments. Here's where we are standing right now inside. We're right about 1/3 of the way into the North Barracks. This was confirmed in recent years by the Virginia Historic Resources. I guess they were questioning some of my work or something, but anyway, they came and dug a ditch through here. They found the foundation here and the foundation there exactly on the spot. All I had to do was take George Washington's plans, use his well, which he also drew on his plans, took that as a central point and took his plans, and was able to lay out the entire fort. They also dug right here, and they did find remnants of the stone that was used in digging the well. You know, the well was dug by taking augers, going down through the limestone, packing it with gunpowder, and blasting. Then they go down farther, blast some more, keep on going. They got down to 103 feet, but apparently they never received the water they was looking for. Because when they reached that 103 feet, I forget the exact wording, it's here in my book, but she said we have not reached, in other words, they had not reached the spring. They were looking for a spring. So what the water we're getting in this well is runoff water through the limestone. Every time we have a range of water, the well is completely full. And you could drink from it, but I wouldn't advise it. Because two visitors back, one of them in 1760 and another one during the Revolutionary War, both complained of the water, drinking it, and they had the runs after drinking the water, and they talked about its taste and so forth. So we go with 103 feet. There is a well that goes to 103 at least. And now whether they went any deeper, there are no records that they went any deeper. But there are records that they went outside the fort to get water for the soldiers, which indicates they didn't use the water. Because Captain Stewart in 1758 reported to Washington that I've had to go outside the fort to get wood and water. And of course they had a lot of sickness in the fort, men getting sick. So we go out. By the way, someone asked here earlier, this is George Washington's company. Not only their names, the description of their physical descriptions and what have you, and I forget what the exact number is, and that's 1757? Yeah, 1757. But he used his company here, plus another one, Captain Mercer's company, most of the time at this fort. But he used this for storing the arms and ammunition, muskets, powder, everything here for the rest of the regiment out on the frontier. And he used this as his command center. I myself, I'm not being prejudiced, but I found that he was very wrong in his calculations in the beginning of the French and Indian War. He thought this was where everything had to be. He took almost his entire regiment and deployed them around here, what I call the northwest frontier. Well, the Indians and the French bypassed him and went down the valley, not the valley, they went over a little bit farther than the valley, went down and they capped the central and southern frontiers of Virginia. Now, a good example of that, they completely destroyed Fort Voss, took everybody prisoner and killed, you know, and then they also hit the Jackson Rivers area down at Fort Dinwiddie, which is right east of Stanton, of Augusta Courthouse, and I forget, they took 29 prisoners and killed 13 or whatever. And George Washington later on realized that they had to get some of the people down there. He only had one captain down on that whole frontier, Captain Hall, Peter Hall. And later he realized he had to visit that frontier, and he started correcting it, and he recommended 22 forts, all running all the way to North Carolina. But in the beginning he said all we need is one fort in Hampshire County, was a fort out here, not here in Frederick. All we need is one fort in Hampshire County, one in Augusta County, and one in Bedford County. But then, when the Indians started attacking that frontier, he changed. Now, Washington made his mistakes, but he learned from his mistakes, corrected them, and went on. He did that throughout his entire life, even through the Revolution. But he won, and eventually, because he corrected his mistakes. So I say I'm not being prejudiced about it, but I did notice that he put all his emphasis on defending this frontier. And of course, the French never tried to reach this fort. And you can see why, because it was the most formidable fort in the Virginia frontier. And the only forts that surpassed it was later on in the French and Indian War, up on Lake Champlain, Fort Ticonderoga, Crown Point, which was a tremendous fort, and Fort Frederick up here is larger, but it wasn't as formidable. It only had 12 cannon. It was 309 feet, where this one was 204 feet. But to give you an example, Fort Duquesne, which was the fort that would concern this frontier more than anything else the French took, was only 140 feet, I think it was, compared to the 204 feet for this. And most of it was stockade at Fort Duquesne before we took it in 1758 and made it into Fort Pitt. Then we had another fort in Pennsylvania called Fort Augusta, the same size, 204 feet, and I've often wondered if Washington might have had the plans of Fort Augusta. 204 feet from bastion tip to bastion tip, but it was half stockade and half horizontal timbers, and that made a difference. This was cannon-proof. They considered it cannon-proof because this 18-foot filled with soil and rock in between the two walls, plus the horizontal timbers, it would take a lot of cannon fire to bring it down. Well, they did with Fort William Henry. You've all seen the movie The Last of the Mohegans, in which the French were able to keep digging and getting closer and closer to the fort. They finally got, that's their northwest bastion of Fort William Henry. They finally were able to get close enough. They put up their cannon and kept pounding that one bastion until that bastion collapsed. And then they had to surrender. And that's when they had the massacre. The Indians massacred the people that they were supposed to be letting go free. And I'd like to point that out, that William Fairfax, George Washington had two plans. The first one he sent to William Fairfax. And William Fairfax had some recommendations. So there was a second plan. And this is the second plan. William Fairfax advised him to put a sally port inside that West Barracks, down through that little ravine, which is out there. Go over and put a redoubt on that next hill. Now Braddock Road goes over on the other side of that next hill. And that way he would be able to prevent what happened to Fort William Henry. Because the French, before they could get up close enough to hit that cannon, you'd have men out in a redoubt to contest them. And so that sally port, part of it may exist today. I don't know. I've been negligent, but next door, where the West Barracks was located, the man says he has in his cellar a stone walkway down deep in his cellar. And that could very well have been part. Someday I've got to take a visit over there, but it could very well be, because there are no records that Washington ever built that redoubt or built the sally port. We can only assume that he did. Well, basically, I did want to, did I say Fort Frederick? We did. Fort Frederick was larger, up here 30 miles away. And that's an interesting story. I'd like you to read in the book about that. Horatio Sharp and Washington, Maryland, Virginia, I guess they've always fought with each other. But even back then, no sooner did the Virginia Assembly approve this fort, Fort Loudoun. Within weeks, Maryland approved Governor Horatio Sharp building a fort on the frontier. Maryland had done nothing about building forts. They helped build Fort Cumberland, which was the King's Fort. Everybody had to contribute to that. So he went up there on the Potomac to build Fort Frederick. George Washington joined him. George Washington went up to visit him while they were working on that fort. And he wanted to make it fireproof. That's why it's all of stone, so that the Indians would learn the technique of burning it down, which they never did that, though. Well, I'm sorry. Yes, they did do one fort up in Pennsylvania. They burned. But anyway, Horatio Sharp was going to have a better fort. He even wrote that this will cost me X number of pounds. However, it's less than what the one in Virginia is being built, and it's much better, etc., etc. You could see there was a comparison. There's a rivalry between the two. Well, neither one was ever attacked with the French, so it doesn't really matter. But it was larger, but it only had 12 cannon. This had 24. Now you can imagine 24 cannon. Even Fort Cumberland, up here at Cumberland, Maryland, only had 12. And Fort Duquesne, that we're talking about, also only had about 12. And Washington had 24. He even had four 12-pounders. That's the biggest they'd made in those days, other than howitzers. 12-pounders, he'd gotten them, they had been one on each corner of the courthouse down here in Winchester when he started building his fort. So that was his first pieces of artillery. And then he got, I think, 12 6-pounders from down at Rock Creek on the Potomac there in Washington, D.C. that Dinwiddie approved that he bring up here. And he kept on until he had 24 pieces in this fort. When the Revolution came around, they took them away. They used them in the Revolution. And this became a prisoner of war camp. They kept there. As, I don't know whether I brought this up to you and I get all confused on the tours, but this one English soldier that was a prisoner said that he was writing about the fort. All they had left then was the barracks, and they had to put up palisades to hold the prisoners in. He said this fort had been built to accommodate about 500. He said, we have double that amount here now. And try to imagine 1,000 men in this 204 by 204 foot edifice. So basically we can go out and I'll show you the perimeters. We will start out here in the northwest bastion, which is right in the corner. This is a part of the Baker Hardy house, a part that well, I'll show it better here. Here's the northwest bastion. Here's the Baker Hardy house. We are standing right here now in this part of the north barracks. And we go out here, the well is over to the left. And this part of the north bastion, we'll go around the north wall. We go across the street, you notice that. Now this is the fort proper here inside. I've put the outline of the outer works, which was, a lot of it was never built. We go out almost in the middle of the street, and the pink brick house on the corner will be the northeast bastion. Then you go along and get over here on the corner of the sidewalk of Park Street and Loudoun, and you'll see where the East Barracks was located in George Washington's headquarters. And then we will come right around, go around. Here's the Fort Loudoun Apartments, and here was where the southwest bastion was located, and you can see where they leveled it all out to build a parking lot. Now there is one place that's going untouched, and that is right here. Here's a little walk going up, anybody wants to see it. And it's level, and you can get the idea of the elevation of that escarpment that the bastion was built on. Now you know they had to build up the escarpments so that they from this point here would be level with that point over there, etc., etc. So it had to be a level. Now if you had a stockade fort, you could go up and down. It didn't really matter. It didn't have to be level. But with horizontal, you had to have the whole thing level. Here's some that were on the original one. I wanted you to look at on the original. We should have had this, and I should have shown you this when it started. This was the way the fort looked after it was constructed. So if you want to come in and study that, we're getting ready to start another tour. This is the northwest bastion. The tip of that northwest bastion I was pointing out to you before right here. There used to be a little tree there with a white car sitting, the back of the white car. And this, we're talking about the fort proper. The walls would be right in here. This is a bastion. They built a cistern here in later years in the 19th century, and they found the body of a soldier. Still had his spurs and everything. They were still intact, all that stuff. And what all happened to all of this, I don't know. I mean, it was just recorded, and they also built another cistern right over here at the Fort Loudoun Apartments many years ago, and it did the same thing because this place essentially has gone untouched. We've had 2 digs here, archaeological digs, and both of them, everything found was artifacts of the period. Of that mid 18th century, we found bayonets, we found musket balls, we found all the stuff that, in other words, they didn't find very much of the present period. There was just a gold mine for any digging here. We're not asking people to come in here with mine detectors and start digging, but someday we want to get more digs and we can outline the bastions and what have you. So essentially now we'll have to go with something like this. And imagine 16-foot walls. Just take it up to about that drain where the drains come together. You can get some idea of how high this fort was, how impressive it stood. Let's walk around by these soldiers and we'll get around the north wall. Is anybody here that can't keep up with me? Just say so.
Oh, yes.
was joking. Now the north wall of the fort is approximately, actually it's a little bit inside of that, inside of the house there now. But they put a cellar under this house several years ago, and again, all they got was artifacts, even pieces of cannon itself, and cannon balls and things like that. So you can see I'm trying to talk up the fact that this place has got to be preserved.
That building belongs to the
Yes, that's what we call the Baker Harding House. Now this house was built by Reverend Joseph Baker, no relation to me, in 1837. And he opened a seminary for girls on this hill. In fact, that's what the Fort Loudoun Apartments was also, they kept on going for year after year after year, all through the 19th century until it became actually part of the public education system of Winchester. On this, and they called it, they called it Fort Hill in those days, but it's quite a history. You will notice here if you walk along the north wall, you can see they didn't even bother to level out. You can see where it drops off here and where the wall was located. Now this is going to be, this get everybody here at all at one time. We'll go across at one time. Because these people here are going to have to be stopped. This lady that owns this is quite aware of what she's sitting on. Now, everybody is, okay, we had a group here before that had a hard time getting down. You'll notice again, there's been no effort made to eradicate the fort itself. This is how it dropped off and why they had to have the escarpment. And you're going to see the escarpment here. So take it easy, go very slow down the Bret. You're not wet, but just go slow.
Hey.
Gets too rough, I'll jump on the back and give me a ride down.
And you turn around and you can see the escarpment. Now just imagine that house being a wall of the fort. The horizontal logs would reach up to the eaves of that house. You can get some idea of how impressive it looked.
Yeah, because you said that had to be level with...
Yes, it had to be level with the escarpment on the other side.
So was that excavated or was that natural hill there?
That's natural.
That's natural.
Come here, I'll show you. That's why I brought you around here.
Uh-oh.
We're
Maybe.
looking at your basket. All they've done is just fence it in and use it for a backyard.
Yeah.
See how it comes to the corner here?
Which one are we at?
Here's her house, and here is the bastion. How it's built up there. And this was the old road to Philadelphia, the old Indian road, which is now an alley, a Kent Lane. And this is why they, in the 19th century, they didn't want to curve around this hill. They went straight through, and that went straight through the fort. Of course, destroying everything. Well, by that time, the people had already cannibalized the fort and taken most of the logs to build houses around here. Everybody, you can talk to almost anybody here, and they've got a little piece of Fort Loudoun. It's either a gavel, or it's a little table made out of it, or it's a house.
How is it compared to Fort Frederick up in Maryland? Is this bigger or smaller?
Oh, this is smaller.
Smaller?
In dimensions. It's 309 feet at Fort Frederick, from bastion tip to bastion tip. But, and the walls were about the same height.
Oh, yeah.
But they only had 12 cannon in Fort Frederick, 24 here. Well, Washington built an extremely formidable fort. He was never going to be accused of another fort necessity.
Ah.
Now you'll see up on this hill a lot of limestone being used by the people, and it's all been limestone. I don't care where they use it. It's all been limestone that someone has worked on, a mason has worked on. So we can assume that most of this stone that you see came from Fort Loudoun, especially the retaining wall for North Loudoun Street. You can tell by the stones right away. You can see the drop off again of the wall of the fort. My plans in my next life is to take all these houses off of this hill
And rebuild the fort.
and rebuild the fort, reconstruct.
Better
will
start
make it
playing
a
to win that
national
lottery.
memorial.
Buy some of these houses.
Lotteries do that.
Yeah.
Now I know you all laugh at that, but you don't know what we went through just to get that sign in front of Fort Loudoun.
You need a Rockefeller.
Well, the point was, when I recommended we put that sign in front of Fort Loudoun, the first answer I got, well, why? You're already in a historic district. I said, yes, but nobody knows the fort was here. And they said, okay. So I kept pushing it. I wrote the text for the sign. It was not approved. It went down to Richmond. You know, oh no. Well, your facts and everything are correct. We've checked them all out, what have you. But we would prefer you not call it the French and Indian War. This is no joke. I said, well, it was the French and Indian War. They said, well, we prefer you call it the 7 Years' War. I said, how did you reach, I got on the phone, I was constantly on the phone, how did you reach this conclusion? Well, the Indians of Virginia don't like to use anymore. I said, get off of it, go down in Washington, D.C., and you'll find American Indian museums, you'll find everything is American Indians, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, etc., etc. And I said, this was not the 7 Years' War. That was declared in 1756 after George Washington had been defeated at Fort Necessity and Braddock had been defeated up at Fort Duquesne. And I said 2 years had gone by. So they started relenting. And to make it better, I went all over Virginia and took a picture of every sign of the French and Indian War. I had a book to go by, and they all said French and Indian War. Well, I whipped them there. They said, well, okay. So when you read that sign, you go back and read that sign, you'll see I did give in, and I apologize for that. They said, we'll go along with it, but we want to put in parentheses 7 Years' War. So up there, you'll find in parentheses 7 Years'
Yes,
War.
and that's the history behind that.
You
Parentheses.
see this, so you knew how much trouble it would be to get this, to make this a memorial, and we went through all that. Well, the reason here is very simple, and I'm not downgrading it at all, but Winchester is a Civil War city. It was fought over 13 times, I forget how many times the battles were fought here. And you can get anything you want if you're a Civil War group. In fact, you can go out to Cedar, we'll get all kinds of grants for you for the Cedar Run group, what, it doesn't matter. But French and Indian War, well, what was that? You know, who cares? But this is where George Washington began his career, his political career and his military career. And in fact, where he started at age 16, he came through this little town and spent a night here on his way out with Fairfax to survey out here on the south branch of the Potomac. We're probably running out of time.
10 minutes, I think.
I got 10 minutes. The East Barracks was right here. I'll hold this up so you can see. Got it upside down. We're standing right here on this curved part of the sidewalk. And here is the East Barracks, starts right here, goes up, across Clark Street, up in front of that, back of that car there. And it was 18
I have a hard
feet
time excavating that.
by 65 feet for that barracks. George Washington, that Colonel, George Washington's headquarters was right where you see that no parking sign. Right here on the sidewalk where those ladies are walking there now. And it came out into the street. This is his headquarters. It came out about 1/3 of the way into the street, went over to that entrance to the lady's house going over there. And on the other side of it, about the third window over, was the gate of the fort. Well, basically, let's go on around because they're going to eat.
Oh, that's right.
Well, that's one of the kitchen. No, one is the kitchen. You're right.
We did get a little exercise
This
today,
is the southeast bastion. They call it the South Bastion. It's a magazine bastion, the most important bastion of all, because this is where they kept all their ammunition, powder, muskets, and what have you. And by 1758, though, they were having to repair it. Because when they built these bastions, they logged over the top of them. They logged over, and the storage of everything was inside. This is the one I'm talking about right here. They put logs and they covered with earth. Well, you get rains, I don't have to tell you what would happen. It starts seeping through, and the first thing you know, the stone started collapsing. So in the latter part of 1758, they were having to repair the pillars of a stone for that bastion. And this is why some people have always assumed that they never finished the fort. Well, the problem with anything like that was before they get it finished, they're already repairing it. And that go on and on. There's no such thing as a completion. But this is the part of the bastion right here.
My grandwife, they walked a lot. I'll walk down with my granddaughter down to the, I work with the you might be right.
Now the outer works of that magazine bastion came inside the man's house there. But again, you can see the drop off. And you can see why they had to make sure the escarpments were level all the way across. And you can imagine how many tons of earth had to be carried in. And remember that we're using oxen and wagons, and men are having to shovel it into wagons and shovel it out of wagons. And also the walls, as I said, from 18 feet up to 14 feet in thickness, all had to be filled with dirt, stone, and what have you. And why it took them at least 2 years to build it, and all the time working with several hundred soldiers. They were soldiers. And I imagine that was difficult at times to get them to work, but anyway. Now here, I want to point out again the stone. Please notice the stone here. It's a retaining wall. Every one of those stones, and they didn't need those kind of stones for a retaining wall for, or even over there for this road being cut through here. We can assume those stones came from the fort itself. Now the man who owned the property after the French and Indian Wars and started the seminaries was right here in this house. This was his home, by the name of Clark. Later became Peyton, and this is why we have Peyton Street over here.
What became famous?
This house. They married, so, you know, family. Married, go off to get his full details. Now let's get ready to go across here. Here we go again. Everybody come up here. Now the gate, no, they're not all up here. Now the gate to the fort, that's this right here, did not line up with North Loudoun Street. That was put straight through from down here. It came out and followed this little ridge path going down into where it would hit the Loudoun Street down here at 2 blocks. You know, there was, as I say, here was a bastion, here was the wall of the fort. Here's George Washington's headquarters as you go through the gate, and here was the officers' quarters here on this side. Now what we're going to see here is the southwest bastion, and until a few years ago that was the most outstanding landmark left of the fort. But in recent years they decided they needed a parking lot. You can still see the remnants over here to the left, but that's all that's left of it. They are pictures, we got them in the resource office. You can see pictures of what it looked like in the 20s and 30s. It went all the way up. The top of that brick wall is the level of that escarpment for the bastion. It came all the way over here up onto the wall of this, and you can see in the pictures, in fact there's a Civil War artist, Taylor, that was with General Sheridan. He drew this bastion from that corner down there, and I think he said it was 12 feet high or something of that order. But here is the level, If you want to see what that level would look like, you can go up in the walk there, and that was the level of that escarpment. Now that's not the walls. Then you go up another 16 feet for walls. But that's the part that they left and put that retaining wall up here. But all of this is a part of the back. They also dug a cistern over in this area. Hey, Bob, look inside the door, Bob, and you'll see they have a montage of pictures of Fort Loudoun inside on the left there. Yeah, they're very proud of the fact that they're sitting right on Fort Loudoun. As I said, if you want to go up there, but there's the level. If anybody, an archaeologist, should be working, it should be at that level up there. That has been untouched. But you can get an idea of how that went out and how high it was over here, why it was so impressive before they made this parking lot.
Now that's like, that's the courtyard of the level part inside the fort where they would operate.
Well, it had to be level because you're laying horizontal timbers.
Oh, okay.
So one corner of the fort had to be level with the next corner, or the cross corner of the fort, you see. And this is why, can you imagine how much, because of this drop-off, can you imagine the tons of earth Washington's men had to haul in just to get it level to start? And I bet his soldiers were very unhappy they were with the Virginia regiment.
Yeah. Right. Well, Bret couldn't line up.
Now the Sally Port that I was talking about would go through here. That was what was recommended by William Fairfax of Belvoir. Recommended that a Sally Port be put through the west barracks, and so that they could sally out in case the French started coming up across, go over by Braddock Street. You know where Braddock Street's located. They would come up with their cannon and start blasting the fort. If they could get up close enough with heavy cannon, they could tear down even what they call a cannon-proof fort like Fort Loudoun. And we'll never know, because Washington left no record or anybody else that Sally Port and the redoubt on this next hill was ever built. But it was recommended. Now this gentleman says in his house down in the cellar there's a passageway lined with stone. I have not seen it. I have not been in there. He was just telling somebody about it. I would love to go in there someday and go down and look and see if that really was part of the Sally Port. All right, let's get back into the fort here. Otherwise, they're already piping. Be careful walking through here. Rush off to my next assignment.
Well.
The well is right up here on the other side of the tent. You can still pump water out of it, but no one is to drink that water. I'm saying that because we have not tested that water. And as I said, back in 1760 and back in the Revolutionary War period, they complained about drinking water from that. The visitors that were here and left their journals, that both of them, those separate years, complained about in the mornings they get up and have the water and what would happen to them in the morning. And so
Don't drink the water.
now the lady we bought the house from, she invited people to drink water from it, but we're not doing that.
So speaking of people drinking that bad water, where were the outhouses?
That's the question I brought up again this morning. It started bothering me over the last several months. We had, especially when you had 1,000 prisoners of war in here. Well, this side's a fort. Where were the privies? And no, that explains why so many men were sick begging the fort. Because the close quarters and the privies, and this man up here he's building a privy, by the way, for officers. The guy with a broad axe, that's what he was explaining. But can you imagine that number of men and having to have privies?
A lot harder to do than now with chainsaw or circular saws.
The prisoners of war were Frenchmen, or?
Didn't want those prisoners in Maryland. Finally, they did relent, let them go through, and they left Fort Loudoun.
Is this where Morgan?
This would be all right, but we get people hanging around in here. I don't know.
I know. I think they should be some should be prisoners.
Hey, would you check and find out if they even belong in here?
Dungeon in the basement.
Are there any other questions? I have to get over here and make an introduction. Any other questions?
You having fun, Chew?
Greyhound or with
Great. You having fun, Chew?
Made for speed.
Yeah.
All your flat work is pretty much done with this. If it's going to be finished work. Everything that's here at the fort is we call rough work. So basically just the tools that you have here, no fancy fingers or any hard tools. Most everything that we do when you come out on the frontier, this is your tool of choice. Bring that in your musket, and within 2 weeks you can put up a 12 by 16 cabin. But you can actually use this tool to do this kind of work, but if you've got an adze, it's much easier because it's designed specifically for that. And for like floorboards or joists or shimming up beams, if you're doing log work on the house itself, the cabin, stand up, you'll use a tool like this. This is a broad axe.
And the handle's supposed to be bent like that? Or is that
Yes, because what it is, I don't have it set up to do a full log, but we have a couple of irons, which are called dogs.
Is that a real one or is that a repro?
That's an original piece. But you would actually have another log set up on its side.
You with the store?
No.
I'm glad you're here.
Yeah, I spoke to Mr. Woods and I want to
Good.
maybe make a couple of copies of DVDs and send it to the foundation. Not that they're that professional or anything, but there's a little something.
Good, yeah. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, I try to.
What's something to eat or drink?
Yeah, I've been with Warren a couple times, video copying what he says, because you know, good to keep that history. Good.
We welcome new members.
One presentation. David has one presentation.
Where are you from, sir?
Just around town,
Oh, you live here in town?
up in Bunker Hill, West Virginia.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
We're over in
Yeah, I'm in the neighborhood, as they say.
Thank you for joining.
I
You
just
going
can't
anywhere
believe
this
it.
summer, or?
Well, we were going to do Point Pleasant,
Uh-huh.
and then things turned out that our couldn't go, so we're not doing it. So I'm showing my horses this summer instead. But our big trip last year was to Old Fort Niagara, and it was such a gorgeous week.
Did you spend like, we went up for like 3 days. Did you spend
Yep.
a whole week or
Well,
close to it?
yeah.
Please, would everyone come around? We're getting ready to start.
I'm Melissa. You guys can press
Out there at the back, everybody come on around.
Join us, or you want to watch? You want to put the flag on the flagpole?
Get yourself a seat out there. You know the colonel, don't you? Come over my right, Suzanne. To begin with today, we have, I'm Norman Baker, but to begin with today, we have David Look, one of our members of the Board of Governors of the,
Just going to do that, honey. Just leave it alone.
okay, Board of Governors of the Foundation, the French and Indian War Foundation. He has a presentation that we'll be making. David?
First, we're going to have a little commercial. Those of you you who aren't members of the French and Indian War Foundation, if you're interested, we have a table over here with membership applications. We also selling some publications. Today we're premiering a new fundraising. It's a coffee cup for the French and Indian War Foundation with a drawing on there of what Fort Loudoun looked like, and that drawing was by our good friend Norman Baker, who's a real scholar on the French and Indian War, and especially on Fort Loudoun. Now, those of you who were at the George Washington breakfast at the George Washington Hotel back in February heard our students who gave various papers, and today we are very fortunate to have one of those students here. Since that day, we have designed a certificate. I'd like to present it to Desi Ramirez. Is he here? Desi, come on up here. Let me put this down for you. I'd like to present you with this certificate for your presentation and turn the microphone over to you to say a few words.
I just want to say thanks, and it's a real honor to be here.
Yes, you can give your speech if you want. He has a speech.
No.
Here, Desi.
Okay.
Hold it up so I can get a picture.
I apologize for the microphone. It's, high tech. But,
One second. Put your certificate out. Your certificate.
oh, getting away from that. I see what you're talking about. Yeah. How's that? How's that? "254 years ago, this month, soldiers of Colonel George Washington's Virginia Regiment began the laborious task of erecting a fort on the site where we are standing today. At that time, I should say, this site was a heavily wooded limestone hilltop lot overlooking the small and recently founded town of Winchester. Over the next several months, those soldiers would convert the lot into the colony of Virginia's most impressive fortification, a command center defense against the French and their Indian allies. It was not an easy task for the soldiers. The trees would be felled, cut to lengths, and hewn into massive timbers, first in the vicinity of the fort proper, and later for a great distance around its perimeter. Tons and tons of earth, stone and rubble would be hauled in wagons to this hill, first to level its top and provide the escarpment base with the bastions and curtains or walls. The massive timbers were then hoisted and maneuvered into place, forming a double wall 16 feet in height. Those timbers laid end to end would literally have reached for miles. The space between those timbers were filled with earth and stone. It is difficult to imagine, with today's powered machinery, the extreme back-breaking labor that was involved in completing this task. Within those walls, designed to withstand the fire of cannons, was erected 3 large 2-story hewn timber barracks and storage buildings, and 2 smaller regimental buildings, one for the commander, Colonel Washington, on either side of the fort's gate. We are here again today to raise the King's colors over this hallowed ground. There have been many American flags as our nation has evolved. The King's colors was our first flag. The men who raised it and paraded before it were British subjects, but Americans. That flag would have flown over the laboring soldiers every day as they worked to erect the fort. 3 months after work began on the fort, it was beginning to take shape. Already there were 14 cannon on site, ready to be mounted in the bastions. Finally, years after actual hostilities had begun in America's French and Indian War, the British king declared war against the French king. Washington selected this yet to be completed fort site as the appropriate place to read His Majesty's declaration of war against the French king to 3 companies of his Virginia regiment. He had his soldiers drawn up a few yards from where we are now standing. That was the parade ground just immediately off to the south here in front lawn of this house. To read the declaration and where His Majesty and many other loyal healths were drank. That's a quotation from Washington. This was followed by a triple discharge of the artillery and 3 rounds of musket fire. Washington, a man fully attuned to the windows of opportunity, used the occasion to formally name his fortress in honor of John Campbell, the 4th Earl of Loudoun, Commander-in-Chief of the British forces in America. It was the first of 3 forts that would honor Loudoun. Washington entertained the hope that Loudoun would visit his fort and would confer upon his regiment the status of the British regulars, a hope that would not be fulfilled. The flag that will be hoisted today, is a gift of the younger man of a man who served in World War I and whose older brother served in World War II. Another brother was a soldier in Korea. Still another was a member of the Navy SEALs in Vietnam. This event today is about freedom. It's about an American struggle that began more than 400 years ago, that continues to the present day. Crucial in that struggle was the conflict more than 250 years ago that was a defining moment in our identification as a nation. It was a struggle that laid the foundation and began the process for the final throwing off of the shackles of tyranny and the quest for liberty and freedom. And it was for soldiers of the French and Indian War, so it has been for all the wars in between. All those soldiers worked, fought, and died for the freedoms provided by this, the greatest nation on earth. And command of the hoisting of the King's colors today, as he did last year, is another combat soldier, Lieutenant Colonel Mark Sullivan, Army Royal Engineer. He served in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Northern Ireland, in Germany, and operated in Kosovo, Africa, and Central America. Sullivan is a parachute-trained professional engineer and has commanded at platoon level in airborne, armored, and air support engineer units. The ambassador of the United Kingdom has directed Lieutenant Colonel Sullivan to represent the British Embassy in the hoisting of the colors over Fort Loudoun. Colonel Washington, a self-trained engineer and combat soldier, would have been pleased and honored. Colonel Sullivan.
Thank you for those kind words of introduction. It's always a pleasure and a little humbling to follow Norman on an address like this. His knowledge of Fort Loudoun and the war is amazing. And therefore, following him, I offer these humble words in gratitude for inviting us here today. When Julie McCall called and later wrote to the ambassador to ask if we could return this year to Winchester, we were delighted. So fond and unforgettable were mine and my family's memories of last year that we felt honour bound to share this incredible day with 2 dear friends, Lieutenant Colonel Phil Potts and Elaine Potts, who is the piper at the back there. Moreover, after the disturbing encounter last year with Bret Osborn's toothless and scraggy reenactment of a Scottish colonial soldier, it was also my sense of duty that encouraged me to invite Kieran, as I needed to show not just Bret but you all just how smart and dashing an officer of the Scottish Division is today. And Kieran has kindly agreed to command the flag ceremony for us today. But the Scottish delights do not stop there, because Elaine, a highly accomplished and talented player and teacher of the bagpipes, will play a mighty tune as the flag is being raised. Thank you, Kieran and Elaine, for joining us today. Last year I spoke of the similar challenges Major George Washington faced building Fort Loudoun and defending the rights and freedoms of the people here in Winchester. And I compared it to those brave leaders and soldiers fighting tyranny and extremism in the cities and villages of Afghanistan and Iraq today. I make no apology for returning to this theme, because it is enduring and costly, and is a campaign that intertwines our nation's domestic security, economic prosperity, and our global endeavours. Together, the United States and Great Britain, along with their coalition partners, continue to make the necessary sacrifice in both national blood and treasure to defeat the persecution and insurgency that threatens to steal the very soul of progress in these countries. We not only commit to this sacrifice because we know it to be true and just, but because we understand that in prosecuting this joint political and military strategy, we enhance the protection of our own nation's way of life. Looking back, I suspect these very same campaign objectives would have all been very well known and understood by George Washington himself when he was protecting the frontier of this colony. But these fine words of strategy would be hollow without the military means to support our shared political objectives. I must therefore take a moment to praise our armed forces. I am continually shocked, amazed, and proud of the outstanding accomplishments and sacrifices of our servicemen and women. They are a shining example of how two nations, joined in coalition, can be greater than the sum of their individual parts. Together, our soldiers, Marines, sailors and airmen are a force for good, whilst retaining the fighting power to be a force to be feared. Our nation's future will be evermore one of mutual interest, shared values and standards. I therefore would like to finish by saluting the United States and Great Britain's armed forces, for I am proud to serve to lead these fine servicemen and women, for I believe they hold the torch to help them lead the way to a brighter future. Thank you and have a lovely day at Fort Loudoun. Thank you.
Save the king!
Cheers for the Piper!
Hooray!
Can't let anybody down not showing the King's dental plan for Scott. A rude awakening for Lieutenant Colonel Sullivan last year. As the Vice President of the French and Indian War Foundation, I wanted to thank all of you for coming out and certainly thank our guests. Appreciate the support from the Mrs. Orndorff, her husband, many of the foundation members that have showed up and helped us support this today. Trying times for us that we're trying to maintain this property and keep us upkeep. But we've had some new ideas. We've got some new friends that showed up today, reenactors, people with historical interests. So we hope we can continue things like this. And it's always a pleasure to see young people like Desi getting involved, learn a little bit about history and participate in that. So our next step is to honor our guests. And what better than to have one of their own countrymen here with one of the finest establishments on the mall. Richard, would you raise your hand? He's promised free grog for all the troops. So, we're going to adjourn, and it's a self-host thing, but we'll be meeting down at the Union Jack. And we've got one more presentation before Norm says anything, and that's for Norm's guiding folks around here on the different trips that we've done. Norm has ventured out actually on Braddock's Road and probably knows more of the sites of where the actual road was, as well as taking us to the different forts along the way. The problem has been is that people aren't sure when he's going out onto the property